To do this as a repeat of what I did just on Tuesday. I was impressed with myself on Tuesday. I covered everything I was supposed to. So, first off, with regard to the quiz questions, the one quiz question is concerning the angels, yes? Are the angels, as described by Aquinas, similar to the quantum theory or the theory of the forces in the universe? Of course, that would not have been something that Aquinas would have said himself, because he didn't know anything about the future of physics, etc. But I got the impression that he's talking about something in between the actual creation, God, basically, and the physical universe as something that's invisible, not made out of material itself, but nonetheless helps organize or structure the way the material world works. So it's, in a sense, the way God affects the things that God wants to happen. And that certainly seems an awful lot like the forces in the universe as science looks at them today. So that's a yes and no question. It depends on your perspective. Yes, if you think that sounds like an intriguing vocabulary shift, especially when you think that it's by the time we get to Einstein, we begin talking about energy and mass instead of spirit and matter. So the vocabulary has changed. We today, in a sense, still talk about spirit and matter, except in our vocabulary we refer to it as energy and mass. And they are interrelatable because of the equation, right? So in a sense, it seems like the vocabulary has changed, and the way we handle the problems has certainly changed, but the concerns that they had as they were trying to solve them seem to me to be remarkably persistent, even way back to Aristotle and so on. So that's the first one. The second one, nobody really knows. That's a example of hagiography. Did Thomas Aquinas chase a poor wench that his brothers had corralled, probably lured with money? Who knows if any of that would have happened, to tempt him in the tower, because they were trying to keep him from joining the Dominicans. Go figure. And he apparently chased her out of the tower with a fiery brand, which is good storytelling, especially when you're trying to point out just how holy a person he was, I suppose. But who the heck could ever verify anything like that? It sounds just like a made-up story just to make him seem impressive, right? And that's the nature of hagiography. If you look it up, all of the saints have their own special stories that explain why they're considered saints by the church. And you could do that with anyone if you want to say how absolutely wonderful your candidate is. You don't want to point out things like, he's only considered to have harassed 80 women, instead of none. Or, did anyone ever keep track of how many women President Trump claimed to have? It sounded like it was a lot more than just 3 or 4, right? Horrible, right? Plus he married 3. I don't want to get into character bashing, especially of our president. But
3 of them married him.
Right, and the others sued him instead, which, well, not all of them. But, got Epstein, that was a friend. That all sounds like, yes, they were all involved in the same kind of miserable male, behavior, which, whatever, right? But if you want to get them elected, well, yeah, you could do whatever. But if you want to get them elected, you say how absolutely, they donated money to the charity, and you don't want to say anything about the charity only spent money on a picture of him that he picked, right? You don't want to get the bad things in there, so that's. But the neat thing about both of those is hopefully in order to answer the question, you had to do some research, which might have meant you look up some philosophy, read some more vocabulary, that kind of thing. So today we're going to talk about Descartes and Hobbes, or Hobbes and Descartes. They're contemporaries. Hobbes is actually born first. And by the way, I realize that this link doesn't work, but you could look up the cogito ergo sum and find well, actually what you'd be looking up are Descartes meditations. And you can find all kinds of resources, Spark Notes, obviously, Wikipedia article on it. Let's just do that. And it gives us a nice picture of the cover. I'll do the same thing with Hobbes's Leviathan, if we do that.
What's the password today?
Anybody know it offhand? I saw it, but I don't remember it. I might be able to look it up. Let me see.
That's me asking if there was class today.
Margin. Did it work?
They change it every single day.
Every week.
Or every week.
So Hobbes' Leviathan, which is the other link. Notice here, in this picture, which I want larger, right? Why is it not going bigger? Aha, there we go. So, the neat thing about the cover, this is the original cover. Notice that the body of the king is made up of 300, somebody counted them, 300 individuals. And notice he's carrying the sword of state on the one side and the crozier or whatever of the church on the other, besides wearing the crown. It's just all kinds of interesting aspects to this. And you have on the right side, you have church things like the church building. This is the hat that the cardinals and bishops wear. I'm not sure what these symbols represent. I guess this also represents a church council. But then over here you get military castle instead of a church, cannon, the crown. So you've got church and state basically together. So that's kind of interesting. However, if we look at them in birth order, we can look at Thomas Hobbes first, who was born a twin of fear, he says. The reason he was born a twin of fear was because his mother was pregnant with him, and the Spanish Armada was attacking England, and she was in such a panic at this threat to her country that she ended up having him 2 weeks early. So he was born as the Armada was approaching. So he considers himself born a twin of fear. He probably learned that from his mother, of course, but that's pretty neat. And by the way, throughout his life, he felt like he was always kind of pushed about by fear of what was going to happen. It was really rough times. The Civil War in England over religion and things of that sort. And so there were quite a few occasions when he fled England, went to Europe. And there were times where he ended up fleeing Europe and coming back. So he kind of ended up going back and forth. And part of the problem was he was very open-minded for his day and saying some things that were really quite radical and could easily get you in trouble, especially in a country where even the king ended up having his head chopped off. And a lot of it was because of religious differences, right? He was Catholic, and Oliver Cromwell and the Parliament were basically Church of England, or maybe even Puritan, depending on their individual beliefs. Oliver Cromwell's secretary, through all of his reign and everything, was John Milton, who is famous in his own right as the blind poet, and the author, I guess, of Paradise Lost is his most famous piece, if you're familiar with that. But if you look at the collected works, that's what he looked like when he was 96. No, I'm just kidding. He died 65 years old. But he was a author that wrote profusely in his complete works, which I have, actually, because the Luzak Library in its infinite wisdom threw them out on a day when I happened to be in the Luzak and walking out, and I saw them in the free bin, which mostly is for people that need toilet paper. Really, right? And I saw this stack of books that all looked beautifully bound, and I thought, what? And I looked at it, and it's John Milton, volumes, whatever, right? So it took me like 3 trips to the car, and I kept worrying that somebody else was going to grab some while I was walking back and forth, but nobody else was interested. I still have them. They're kind of, and I have actually tried to read some of them, and they're just absolutely incredible, because they're like the letters, like from Oliver Cromwell, who probably didn't even know about the letter, to the King of France. Our ship, was captured by your ships, and we really want our ship back and our captain back, and, you know, they were not, you know, in, you know, any danger. You know, it was all, you know, diplomatic stuff that somebody's got to do, and he was the one that did it. Oliver Cromwell didn't. So he was not just a poet writing all kinds of things. But if you're familiar with John Milton, Paradise Lost, I've mentioned it when we were talking about Augustine, and we were talking about the followers of Mani, the Manichaeans. I mentioned that Gnostic heresy continued on, for example, in John Milton's Paradise Lost is one example of it, but also I mentioned the Church of Latter-day Saints is considered by many to be another example of that same heresy, which, by the way, if you're a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, you don't consider a heresy, right? You know, so calling, by the way, you are all heretics officially.
Sweet.
And it's not my fault, it's just true. And it's explained in a book called The Heretical Imperative by Peter Berger. And it explains that the definition of heresy is believing that you can choose for yourself what you want to believe. And as an American, you're required to believe that. So strictly speaking, it's the heretical imperative, being an American citizen. I mean, I know as an example, when I joined the Army, one of the things they asked me, and I didn't feel offended, they said, "What religion are you?" And they had like a list. You know, none of them were like Flying Spaghetti Monster, Pastafarians, or, you know, we're all like serious mainline religions, you know. And one of them would be non-denominational. You get to be non-denominational. Christian, but non-denominational. Islam was not on the list, by the way. I think Judaism was, but in any case,
Why would they take that one off the list? Or not include it?
why did they not have Islam on it?
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I don't think anyone thought there were Islamists in the United States, maybe. Not enough to worry. I don't know. Although I remember there was an issue of Sikhs joining the military because by their religious...
Of what?
Sikhs?
What are those?
Sikhs. It's a religion in India mostly, but it can be any place. Sikhism.
Oh, okay, I've seen that before.
Pardon?
I just haven't heard it now.
Yeah. Yeah, but see, the thing is, the males are required to wear that hat. And of course, the question is, in the military, you're supposed to all, you know, wear the same uniform, which is what uniform means, right? And so the question was, could they wear that hat? And as I understand it, they can now. You know, and that also means they need a beard, etc. That's what they all have to look like, apparently. The males. Right. So, how did we get onto that? But, so you have to make a choice. The reason in the Army is they want to know what religion to put on your dog tag, so that when you get shot and you're dead, they know which chaplain has to work, you know, when, you know, your body comes. You know, you don't want to make the wrong chaplain have to do extra work, you know. And, hey, wait a minute, he's not a Catholic.
Nowadays, the chaplains are trained in multiple.
Well, that's because there's fewer chaplains, because they're saving money. So, chaplains are captains. So why have extra captains sitting around when you don't actually need them? One of my favorite examples of a poor chaplain is the one in Catch-22.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely hilarious. But so, just so you know, you're all heretics.
And who wrote that book?
was Peter Berger. Absolutely one of my favorites. He died just recently. An Invitation to Sociology was the first book that I read of his, because that was a textbook in my Introduction to Sociology course, Invitation to Sociology. And in fact, I used it as a textbook in the sociology course I taught at APU, because I thought it was such a good book that folks ought to read it. But we could talk for days about him and all of his work. Pardon?
I said Alan Missy.
He,
He's
he,
dead
he died, what year was it? 2017. So,
now. Penn Brookline.
not too many YouTube videos of him speaking, and he was very old in them, even though he was very prolific and taught in lots of places and all sorts of things. But the cameras kind of didn't come along until, okay. But so Thomas, back to Thomas. Another contemporary of Thomas Hobbes is William Shakespeare. Anybody ever heard of Shakespeare? You could call him Billy Wigglesword for short. That's just a terrible joke. It doesn't work. Instead of William, you could shorten it to Billy. Instead of shake, you could have wiggle. All right, forget it.
It's a very Shakespearean joke.
No, it wasn't. No. I don't think he did that kind of thing. He had a lot of humor, of course, but his was filthy, so I can't really use it in my life.
Sure you could.
Well, I remember using it in Chugiak High School when we were teaching Romeo and Juliet. I mean, I was the substitute that day, and I'm teaching Romeo and Juliet, and the students are all like, this is exciting stuff. They're talking about sex. And they went, what? Sex? And I said, yeah, I mean, Mercutio, he's lying on a table, sticking his sword up in the air and waving it, What's that sword supposed to represent? So his penis. Just okay. Mercutio's a god, so no. Okay, forget it. I can mention the word penis because this is college. Yes. Okay.
Do you have to edit that out of the video now?
No. Probably be the only one to notice it, Okay, but so William Shakespeare. By the way, I'm not convinced that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare.
Elaborate, please.
I'm a Baconist myself. Francis Bacon.
I've heard people say that. I've never heard a convincing argument. What is your convincing argument? Because I'll bet you have one if you're convinced. Well, not convinced, but persuaded.
So, Francis Bacon was probably the most intelligent individual of his generation. By the way, one of his mentees was Thomas Hobbes, so that's kind of an interesting connection. And he was thrilled with Thomas Hobbes. He thought Thomas Hobbes was brilliant. By the way, one of Thomas Hobbes's mentees was the future Charles II. Charles I had cut off. Oliver Cromwell rules as the Lord Protector, dies after 9 years. His son rules for about 9 months, not nearly as good. And then he's replaced. There's riots all over England, and eventually they all decide, let's bring back a king. Okay, so they contact Charles II, the heir to the throne, and invite him back, and he comes back. By the way, he digs up Oliver Cromwell's dead body, chops his head off, and sticks it on a pike outside of London, which is what Oliver Cromwell had done to his dad, Charles I. So that's just,
But what did Hobbes have to say about Charles II?
oh, well, in the Leviathan,
Oh,
he argues that what we need is an enlightened, absolute monarch. And by the way, we've got one, because he's my student.
okay.
Yes, you know, I taught this kid, and I can guarantee he's an absolute monarch, enlightened, which means that his values will be one with the values of the country. So every decision he makes will be the right decision for the country. It's not like he's,
Was the term absolute power, or is it absolute power corrupts absolutely around that time?
right. Well, so Hobbes, let me start with his teacher, his Bacon, who, by the way, is also a possible author of Shakespeare. And there's like clubs you can join, which others say Lord Shaftesbury and so on. Biggest problem is that Shakespeare apparently didn't have an education. His wife did a little bit, but neither of them really very much. He was an actor in The King's Men, I think, or whichever the troupe was. The trouble for Francis Bacon was he was a noble, the chancellor, and very important. And the people that wrote and participated in the plays were riffraff. And so even if he enjoyed it, he kind of officially couldn't really participate officially because that would be below his class. So the thinking is that he wrote at least some of the plays, maybe all of the plays, who knows, but then passed it off as Shakespeare, being the author, who did make money off of them, enough money that he had a nice living and everything. By the way, though, you could also argue that Shakespeare's wife was actually part of the writing, and that really actually makes a lot of sense because the female characters in Shakespeare's plays are so much stronger than the males.
They're just so, the plays are just so consistent, so is it, it's challenging to imagine that it was written by multiple people, but obviously Shakespeare and his
I'm
wife
not suggesting multiple people,
collaborated.
but the idea that there are multiple people that people argue might have been the actual author.
Yeah. No, I'm not, I know you're not saying all these people in one universe collectively, but just the idea that
They were all, one of them
one of them did.
wrote the plays. Maybe there was some interaction, but there is one a log in one of the libraries in England where Francis Bacon writes out different versions of Shakespeare, like he's trying out different ways of signing
Yeah, that's
Shakespeare.
funny.
And you can see he actually selects one particular one.
Uh-huh.
So it looks almost, and that's one of the, like, some in the club kind of, argue that this is proof that it was actually Francis Bacon that became the author Shakespeare. So I don't know.
It's
That's just kind of interesting. But he did write, and some of the things he wrote are absolutely famous. One of the things he wrote, for example, is the Novum Organum, which is a new tool. If you remember, Aristotle gave us the organum, which was a collection of various, like the prior analytics, the posterior analytics, the category A, and so on. You put those all together, and basically that gives us Aristotle's logic. But remember, Aristotle's logic was deductive, so a way of proving from things you already knew aspects of those things you already knew, but not really able to give you new information. What Francis Bacon attempts to do in his new tool is focus on induction, because he realizes that science needs to develop new knowledge that hasn't been passed down. Aristotle didn't know everything. I mean, a lot of people thought that they did, right? But by the time of Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes and Galileo, more and more things are being realized that were wrong with Aristotle's works, especially, for example, the idea of the sun being the center of the solar system instead of the Earth, right? So that's the Copernican system, right? And they did move in that direction, right? The idea that the Earth was moving as well as the other planets around the sun and not all around the Earth, right? And in his new tool, one of the things he says is that people are misled by 4 different mistakes that we make. One of them he calls the cave that we're growing. So it's the cave, the 4. It probably isn't here. This is about the book, so. Here we go. Well, so he calls them idols, the idols of the cave, idols of the tribe. So those are rooted in human nature itself. So there's a lot of things that, because we're human, we're misled into thinking that these things are true, kind of maybe like the traditional square of opposition. Maybe that appears true to us primarily because of the way we perceive things, as an idol of the tribe, perhaps. Then the cave would be like my own particular family. My family all grows up believing that, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. So anybody that isn't making money for themselves enough to live off of ought not to be supported by the state, because after all, you're just going to spoil that child, right? So what you need to do is let them be punished naturally by not having enough to eat. Then they'll learn and get out there and work, right? So, on the other hand, I might have grown up in a family where everyone feels like there's so many people out there that can't afford to get good jobs and good training, and so we need to help them until they can, by, right? Because, that's a nurturing parent instead of, the strict father kind of, right? So definitely have that kind of a cultural divide in the United States. And you could almost see it as the divide between conservatives and liberals, right? And by the way, I'm stealing that from a linguist, what's his name? He wrote, "Don't Think of a Pink Elephant." You familiar with him?
I've heard of the book, but I can't remember the author.
Pink. I shouldn't have said pink. Don't think of an elephant. George Lakoff. George Lakoff refers to these as frames. We've got 2 basic frames of how parenting works. One is the strict father figure, and the other one is the nurturing parent. One turns out, of course, to be basic to conservatism, and the other to liberalism, etc. But, so, idols of the cave. And then we have the idols of the marketplace. These are like your business associations and those, and how they lead you to believe certain things because of the peers that you have in the marketplace. But you should test those. You shouldn't just believe them. And then the last one is the idols of the theater, which is really a pseudonym for the church, which actually makes sense if you think of it, because the theater, even the theater that he might have been writing for as Shakespeare, originated on the church steps, right? You know, the reason we have the theater set up as a stage is originally these were morality plays during the Middle Ages, where the play would take place on the steps, and the square facing the steps was where the audience would stand, and you'd have the play go on at the steps, and the various entrances and so on would have been the doors on the church, and so you have these different characteristics of the way the stage would be laid out, that it actually became the way modern stages are laid out, essentially. But what he's trying to suggest here is that the idols that have misguided men's souls from the dogmas of the philosophers and misguided laws of demonstration, etc. He's talking about the church pretty clearly, actually. Philosophers, yes, but remember the philosophers, like Aristotle, was adopted by the church, and then that became a requirement that you believe that the earth is in the center of the universe, right? No, don't you dare think that the earth goes around the sun, etc., right? And so on. So Bacon is already moving in a direction that leads, I think, Hobbes to join forces with René Descartes and Galileo. I'm not repeating that his actual name was Galileo. Or was it Galileo Galilei?
I think it was that one.
Second?
I think so.
But both of them are used, and his father was also Galileo, but I forget what his first name was. He was involved in a lot of interesting things in music, by the way, Galileo's father.
Yeah.
Guitar music, and the way the instruments are tuned was an argument at the time. Seamus is interested in music, so I thought I'd throw that in. All of that I learned in the book Galileo by Heilbrunn, which I highly recommend if you get the chance. What? Where is it?
Something here is spelled wrong or something.
Oh, maybe I'm misspelling his name. Galileo Galilei. How about this? New biography. Where did it go? biographies, of course. I don't know, but I don't want to waste time looking for it either. I have the link on my notes that I already emailed you, by the way. So, look for that. Okay, so Thomas Hobbes, born in Malmesbury, which,
Found
you found it?
it by J.L. Heilbronn.
Okay,
Is
so,
it? It's on Amazon.
so I spelled it wrong?
Heilbron.
H-E-I-L.
Lbron.
N-N?
No, just one N.
Just one N.
Yeah.
Should not have been hard. There it is. How easy was that? Google usually treats me with more respect. One letter off. That's terrible. So, Galileo. Absolutely cool book, by the way. And part of his thesis, by the way, is that between the Pope and Galileo, the Pope understood that it could be either model, or maybe even other models besides, but Galileo thought it had to be one or the other, and didn't realize that we're looking at human perspectives, etc., models, and absolutely wanted to insist that it was the one, whereas the Pope was the one that was really more of a modern, postmodern mind, and just was trying to keep all sorts of hellacious events resulting of having a highly respected scientist in the church, because he was a Catholic professor and so on at the University of Pisa. By the way, a lot of his experiments were at the Tower of Pisa, which you're all familiar with it, right? It's the one that kind of tilts weirdly. So if you're a tourist, everybody all poses like this, like they're trying to hold it up from, far enough away that it looks like you're, selfies. But they say that it was, when he was doing experiments, it was dangerous walking around the bottom of that because he was dropping weights off, so be
Lead
careful.
balls, like cannonballs or something.
So be careful.
I think he had like an aid at the very bottom of the ground, as close as he could get, so he could like
Measure.
measure if it actually hit the same time, or maybe one was a bit delayed.
Bowling ball.
Yeah, grandfather size, but not grandfather the safety size.
Oh, you could always hire a new, peon. Oops, get a new one. We're always looking for work. Okay, so Galileo, absolutely fascinating. And he's interconnected. He writes to other people. In fact, the one book that he was strictly forbidden to publish, his friends got a hold of it and they published it in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And what they did was they wrote to Galileo and said, "We're planning on publishing this. Do you want to say anything?" And so Galileo wrote a preface for the book telling everybody that it wasn't his fault that his friends published the book. So that was actually part of the book, his explanation that he had nothing to do with it, so that he couldn't get in trouble for the book being published, etc. But let's think about that for a minute, because how did it help that it was published in Amsterdam? Why wouldn't the Pope have beaten them to crap, for doing what he didn't want them to do? Well, the reason was Amsterdam was influenced by the Reformation. So we have this guy. You've probably all heard
Same one.
Martin Luther. Have we talked about Martin Luther before?
We've talked about one so far. Is it the same one? There's a lot of Martin Luthers.
Well, this one is this one that is an Augustinian, Okay, so he's an Order of St. Augustine, monk, PhD, professor at Württemberg or whatever. At the time, the Pope was trying to build the big Vatican that is there now. And he was in need of money in order to pay for it. By the way, it was kind of like 2008, the stock market had crashed and everybody's finances were crap, and the Pope was desperate for more funds. And so even though everybody was poor, he was trying to find new ways of getting more money from the members of the church, everybody, right? And so he had several different priests go around selling what were called indulgences. I don't know that they still, I guess you could still get indulgences, but basically it was a get your parents out of hell free card, you know, that you could buy, right? You know, because everybody sins, so everybody needs some punishment. And so, you know, there's not only hell, you know, for the irredeemable folks, but there's also purgatory. At least that's what my granny always used to call it, purgatory. It's really purgatory, purgatorio, if you're Italian, right? And, but granny always called it purgatory, you know, because if you were a turkey, you needed to be perked, I guess, you know. She only had one tooth.
Wasn't hell cold in Dante's Inferno?
In Dante's Inferno, but he totally invented all of that.
Oh yeah, but no, he walked through it. He said it himself. With Virgil and...
Well, Galileo's involved in this. When you look at...
Isn't he in like the... not
Galileo
wasn't he in the
image of hell, right? And this is the way, and the problem was if hell was structured the way Dante, I don't know if you can see it or not.
submarines?
Well, the problem is how big it had to be. Right. You know, how big it has to be. And the thing is, there were no supports in the middle dome over hell.
Yeah.
So the question was, architecturally, how could that be? You know, how could you build hell?
So they're actually trying to put like realism to it.
I think this was Galileo's drawing. He did do drawings of hell to try to, it was lots of folks trying to argue how could hell look that way, etc. See, they're arguing over the structure of hell. How would it be?
So was it Dante that kind of just kept his own idea of the? Because the
Yeah,
rings, 7
he
rings.
kind of came up with his. Yeah, that wasn't based on the scripture or the church dogma. It was Dante's own
The Divine Comedy.
winging it imagination. You know, it was political. He put political enemies at each of the levels for what they did,
Right.
and then tried to set them, you know.
Yeah, because traitors were, I think, in one of the last rings. Right?
Yeah. Well, he was pissed off. You know, he was evicted basically from town because he loved, what's her name? I forget.
Oh yeah.
You know, so, but
Penelope?
no, that's Ulysses.
Yeah.
Pene means to weave, and lope means to unweave.
Beatrice.
Beatrice. Thanks. Wow. Genius. Was fast with the keys. Right?
No, it's just
Okay. So yeah. Okay, but so Martin Luther is upset with the way they're begging for money from his people. It's a terrific movie if you're curious. The name of it is Luther, and it's did I show this?
Mhm.
I did? Okay. So I did talk about it. And did I mention that the actor that played Luther in the movie was the brother of Voldemort?
Joseph Haynes.
Ray Fiennes, and
Haynes.
the other one. It might be more than one. I don't know.
There's 37. A whole
37 fake levels of hell. Wow. Yeah. But so Martin Luther famously nails his 95 theses to the bulletin board, the wall, the door of the university, the cathedral, and the worst part of that was that someone took it down and took it to the printer, and they now had a printing press, and the printer thought this would be great, printed off who knows how many thousand copies, and they scattered them all over the kingdom, and so everybody jumped on the bandwagon. It wasn't just Luther.
Are there copies of those still?
Oh yeah,
Oh, well, that's interesting.
yeah. In fact, it might even be in this page. If you 95 theses, click. There they are.
Oh.
It's not my fault. This is famous, actually. Well, you know, he was trying to reform the church.
What do you suppose his motivation was?
He was pissed off at the individuals selling indulgences to his people because they were giving away their money that they needed in order to feed their own children. He was really caring about his own flock, and he wanted to take care of them. And they were basically just bilking them for money. When the Pope had more money than anybody anyway, and probably could have paid for the whole thing out of his own pocket, but didn't want to, right? So politically, this becomes an issue, and the various northern German states adopt Luther's church as a tool to keep them from being abandoned by the church, right? You know, so people, you know, if the Pope said you are excommunicate, right? You're not allowed to go to heaven. You're out. Whoa, that would really put the fear of God in people that believed in that, right? But if you had your own church saying, oh, you're saved, sola scriptura, right? Just believe, you know, and you're saved, right? By faith alone, right? Which was part of what Luther apparently told people, rather than works. And works included giving the church money, right? You know, so you don't have to give the church money in order to be saved. Well, that's a big enough of a break that people will be happy with that. And it started its own church instead of it reforming the Vatican and stopping them from trying to make money the way they did. And keep in mind that at the same time that the Vatican was trying to build his Vatican, and Martin Luther is starting this church reform, you also have the Europeans battling against the Ottomans. If you think about the various, the Battle of Vienna.
Is this post Attila?
This is what?
Post Attila the Hun. I feel like I'm
This
like
is the
maybe-
Ottomans, yes, it's way
Okay.
after the Huns. This is the Ottoman 1529,
I think they're the same.
and you know there's other battles as well, as you can see 1485. So the Ottomans kept basically coming close to completely taking over Europe. Remember too, Spain is partly Ottoman Moor,
Yeah.
right? Until El Cid, who's Charlton Heston in my mind, right? He wins the battle against the Moors and chases them out, which remember that also led to Moses Maimonides fleeing from Spain and ending up Saladin's advisor in Egypt. But so the Ottomans, the Mormons, sorry about that, the Muslim came very close to taking over all of Europe. And even after the siege was lifted, part of it was just the Sultan was, the heck with it, it's not worth it, and went back. He actually had plenty of forces. Shames.
So you've now clarified to me that Luther's intentions were just, but the adoption.
I didn't mean to.
Well, it was an implication when I asked what was.
I'm just saying that the church is already
Well, so
in trouble from.
So his motivation was not for anything other than the welfare of the people that he was responsible
Yes,
for.
I would say that.
But the adoption of Lutheranism, it seems like, was politically motivated, not morally motivated.
Right.
So
Right.
would you consider this religion just, or any more just than the religion that it sought to reform?
Ooh, well, that gets into a big question about justice in itself.
It was perhaps more just than the Roman Catholic
Yeah.
Church.
I would say that in a sense, justice is evolving, and at that point, that was a significant leap for justice.
Mhm.
And just briefly, if you think of it this way, all of the, not including Spain, which to some extent wasn't a successful empire builder, is what they did was they sent their ships, Cortez and others, to take gold from the colonies and bring it back
Mhm.
to Spain, where they took the gold and spent it
Mhm.
in Amsterdam to buy stuff. So that the Dutch ended up with all the money, and eventually the Spanish were bankrupt, especially when they had all the ships that they used in the Armada. And I didn't mention, if you're familiar, that the Armada was heading towards England, and hence Thomas Hobbes's mom had Thomas a little early. And of course, if you're familiar with Elizabeth riding her white horse along the beach, thinking she would single-handedly chase the Armada away, because she didn't have much of an army, and the Armada was full of Spanish troops. But what happened was there was a storm, and to protect the Armada, the admiral put all the ships together, tied them, linked together to protect them all. And when they realized, the Brits realized that Sir Walter Raleigh took 4 fire ships and sailed them into the fleet, which was all tied together, and the whole fleet caught fire and sunk. And the Spanish were bankrupt. And England was saved by a miracle. And by the way, Sir Walter Raleigh was probably one of Elizabeth's boyfriends. So, not to mention tobacco and all sorts of other interesting things that he brought back from the colonies, right? Sir Walter Raleigh, he's on the, you could buy cigarettes that were called Raleighs, right? In his honor, right? Just so you know. In any case, so Spain was an empire of sorts, but didn't do things right to actually grow in wealth. They basically made a lot of gold, got gold and silver, but then blew it all. And so, still today you could go and see Spain had been wealthy, but now needs every tourist dollar they can get. But the next empire was the Dutch, in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and their economic power was in the use of wind. The way they built their ships were very advanced over the others, plus the windmills, literally. You think, wow, that's cute, quaint, but actually it was quite a significant development because of what it was able to do. And so the Dutch really were the first major empire of that sort. And then England was the next empire based on coal power. And next economic advance. And by the way, the United States was the next major advance in empire building, and that was because of oil. So that's kind of impressive.
Would France be up in there?
Um,
Are you wrong though?
Yeah, no, I don't know about that.
France did build a bit of an empire, especially, of course, Napoleon across Europe, and that totally changed the political structure of Europe, because Napoleon's code changed a lot. So that's kind of impressive, but and a lot of the countries in Africa were French, still are, by the way. If you go on Franz von Kott to watch the news, a lot of the news is reported from countries that speak French in Africa. And the French think of them as French. And by the way, they can move to France. Those the folks,
That's
yeah,
interesting.
a lot of them do, actually. How did I get into that? Okay, so the neat thing about the Netherlands, right? And I should mention, even though Martin Luther is going to give us the Lutheran religion, one of his friends is John Calvin. And just take a look at the picture on this guy, because it's funny, I think. So John Calvin, who's also a member of the Augustinians initially, but starts his own Reformed church in Geneva, Switzerland, which become known as the Calvinists. You're familiar with that, right? And another friend is John Knox, who's from Scotland, and John Knox is a real cup of tea. Some of his tracts. Remember, Scotland was ruled by a woman at the time, and he was furious about that. There's no what?
Go back. What was that?
I got the wrong John Knox. That's yes, of course. How could Google do that to me? I don't know.
Oh, that was pretty outstanding. The reveal.
But so John Knox is Scottish and goes back to Scotland and starts the Presbyterian religion. Now, the neat thing about the Presbyterian religion is that the presbyters run the church, and they're a council of the wealthy in the town. And so they're the ones that decide who should be the minister and basically what should be the sermons and things of that sort. If they don't like the minister, they could fire him, and so on. And so that worked really well. And as a result, they decided, let's try that on the town government. And so they basically restructured their town governments on a democratic model, really run by the elite of the town.
So like
Right.
oligarchy?
Oligarchy, maybe. And that influenced Edinburgh, and Edinburgh influenced England, and that's about the time that we get Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes. So if you think of it, when the Church Reformation decides that let's not believe that we have to follow what the dogma of the Pope is, we can think for ourselves, and especially now that they also all begin translating the Bible into the language of their people. Martin Luther translates it into German at the same time as Shakespeare and Thomas Hobbes. You also have the King James translation of the Bible, which is kind of, Elizabeth actually started it, but James was the one that finished it, right? So it's considered to be the King James Bible, right? In English, right? So when you have all this happening at the same time, you get the idea that people are encouraged to think for themselves. And Shakespeare is an interesting part of this. I might have mentioned already that Harold Bloom, who recently died, I think he was 89. But he argues in his book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, that the modern individual, and we'll talk about what we mean by that, but the modern individual was invented by Shakespeare, and Harold Bloom would absolutely argue that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. He's not a Baconist or any of the other. And his argument for that is, of course he did. You know, that kind of argument. Of course Shakespeare was Shakespeare. But in this book he argues that the modern concept of the human was invented by Shakespeare in the play Hamlet. And I bet you could tell me the exact line where it first occurs.
To be or not to be.
To be or not to be. Because what we have, says Harold Bloom in that case, is a actor who's acting the role of a man thinking to himself, pondering whether or not he should commit suicide or not because of how life is and how his own peculiar situation is. Now, you know, I think I mentioned when we were talking about St. Augustine that it seems to me that St. Augustine does a lot of that. But it is true that St. Augustine is always talking to God.
So did they, because I think, isn't the play set in Denmark?
Yes,
So did,
but it was a British play.
okay. Were they
probably
using the setting of Denmark to kind of circumvent any religious criticism of that line?
No,
No, okay.
I don't think so. There were probably other variants of that play by other playwrights too. A lot of the plays that Shakespeare's famous for had similar plays written by others, but it was Shakespeare's peculiar way of developing the plot and the lines, etc., that seems to really have kept Shakespeare going. Samuel Johnson is also considered to have really brought Shakespeare to light, because all of these folks write these things and they're popular in their own day, but the next generation is looking for the new thing instead of the old thing. But Samuel Johnson was the one that got the first portfolio published with all the plays, and that's still, you know, the biggest museum, by the way, is in Washington, D.C., the Folgers Museum.
That was the Smithsonian, or is that the same?
It's its own museum right outside of the Library of Congress, where you can actually go, and I think every night you could go and hear a new play, a Shakespeare play, and they have all kinds of things. They have the largest collection of Shakespearean stuff in that particular museum, library, etc., theater, whole thing. Right there in D.C., right down from Congress. It's pretty neat. There's a lot of stuff there, by the way.
This reminds me of a book that you brought up not recently actually, probably in one of the first classes, about humans maybe developing God to address hearing themselves think for the first time. Is this like one of the
That was the
subsequent steps of that evolution is argued that Shakespeare was the first
The
to articulate
bicameral
it.
mind.
Yeah, yeah, that. It's not the same, but well, obviously it's much later in history.
So if you think of our minds as computers and our thoughts like software,
Mhm.
and the software that we have, our thoughts are installed through our growth with our peers and school and the media, all those things, right? But that software has been evolving, if you think of it this way, so that what we've got going today is we're all thinking in modern
Yeah.
American contemporary, so the tools and the way we think about ourselves and what we ought to do and what's wonderful in life and all that are our period, our zeitgeist, our time, the spirit of our times, basically. At least in our particular cultural milieu, it's probably of course, it'd be very different if you were speaking Hindustani or something else, right? Or Chinese, and so on. But if you think of it as a cultural milieu that we're in, that cultural milieu has evolved through these. I mean, what we're talking about really is the history of thought and the development of this, right? And so it's hard for us to think back to Augustine, to Aristotle, and think, they didn't really think about themselves the way we do, although it's certainly obvious they don't have English, they don't have, a lot of this history of modern concepts, they don't have evolution, they don't have modern physics, and all those things, right? They don't have Google Earth so that you could look all over the earth from your chair, right? So, I mean, there's tons of things that are different about the way we view the world than previous generations, even just 10 years ago. I was a kid your age. I did not have the internet. We were lucky we had an electronic typewriter with an erasing thing, that could, Go ahead.
I guess no. My question, I guess, isn't very broad. It's just, is he arguing that Shakespeare set the stage for the postmodern way?
That would eventually come, but postmodern is really post-romantic period, and so you're looking at the 1830s, 50s.
You're right. I used the wrong word.
But you're right. I mean, you're looking here at 1588.
Yeah.
So there's a long way to go. But another interesting aspect of this is Descartes. If we go back to Descartes, we haven't talked about yet. So this is the French favorite philosopher, Descartes, René Descartes. And notice that he's born after Thomas Hobbes and dies before Thomas Hobbes. He's 53 instead of 91, or whatever Hobbes was. Well, it's kind of odd. Hobbes, besides saying that he was born a twin of fear, also argues that one of his the most important quotes from Thomas Hobbes is that the life of a human being is nasty, brutish, and short. Which is, I mean, if you just go Thomas Hobbes quotes. How come that's not doing anything? Anybody usually see nasty, brutish, and short somewhere. How come there's so many? All these are famous.
Type in nasty, brutish, and short, and Google will give it to you.
Yeah. Maybe Google heard me say how wonderful Google was. So no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Well, that's one of his famous quotes, but he himself was wealthy, lived till he was 91, which is pretty darn old even today, right? And he got to play tennis in his retirement. King Charles II is riding through town and looks down and sees him and says, "Hobbes, my old tutor, I owe you a pension." So he gets a retirement pension, lives in a nice, wealthy home. He wasn't the noble that owned the home, but they were taking care of him as a, he's our favorite, old guy, or, however that works. And once he died, they buried him there in that church, Malmesbury. By the way, the town still celebrates Hobbes. Every year they vote for a new philosopher of the town, even though they're just their own townsfolks. They vote among themselves for someone who's the philosopher of the year. They have a special dinner in honor of Thomas Hobbes, and they invite a philosopher from somewhere to come and speak at the dinner right there in the main place in Malmesbury. And when he was old enough, he went into the cloister there in Malmesbury, which is still there, although it's now a tourist thing. It was a garden, and it was the thing that got me up until recently. The gardeners were notorious for being the naked gardener. And so Malmesbury.
Oh, it was a person.
Pardon?
Okay.
Those two.
Gotcha.
And I don't know, it's a tourist thing. You could go in and look around their garden, and you might see them in there pulling weeds and so on, but I'm not sure that would be such a neat thing, considering. But I believe he died. And what, they lost their plot in divorce. Probably ugly, arguing over who's uglier. I don't know. I don't know what happened. It's probably in the British newspaper. So Malmesbury, this is the cloister though. So they own the cloister. It's a cafe and a gardens where the monks would all raise plants and stuff. So it's pretty interesting. But what's the difference between the two of them? My first quiz question, by the way, is which one, Thomas Hobbes or René Descartes, was more influenced by Galileo? I don't think there's a right answer. It's just kind of up to you to do some research and figure out who you think might have been more influenced. So if we're looking at Descartes, Descartes is raised in a Jesuit school. He's definitely familiar with the typical knowledge of the late Middle Ages. But one of the things that he finds an issue is that his teachers argue among themselves over whether or not universals exist or not. So if you remember, Aquinas kind of solved the problem of introducing Aristotle into the church dogma. You still have the Platonists who believe, along with the church dogma, that the abstract spiritual entities exist, even though they have no matter. But you have Aristotle's philosophy that says only things that have matter exist. Aquinas solved the problem by saying they're both right, and there's spiritual substance, and lots more besides, which made things very complex, and you still end up with sides. So even though the church said, okay, we're good, you can both study both, church dogma and Aristotle, and you're okay, because as long as you follow Aquinas, you're not going to be a heretic, right? You'll be good. So you still have the nominalists who take the Aristotelian side too much, and you have the Platonists like Duns Scotus who take the Platonist side too much. So you still have this dispute going on among the teachers that he's growing up listening to. And so he figures from his youth that he someday will solve this problem by putting all of knowledge on a firm basis. And one party he was at, a cardinal, said, well, why don't you? And so he packed up his stuff and moved to the Netherlands, where he would be relatively safe. Now, there's a good reason for why he might have done that, I think. A.C. Grayling, who is really cool on Descartes and other things, and this is my favorite book that I've read on Descartes, A.C. Grayling. He argues that the Jesuits used Descartes as a spy for France. So as Descartes finished his education, he ended up joining the military and traveling. And by the way, the aspect of the military that he was in was concerned with cannons. Cannons were a new thing. You know how cannons fire stuff, cannonballs and stuff, and you end up with a trajectory that looks like this. Well, that's new math. And Descartes is famous as a mathematician for developing a mathematical formula that explains the various arcs and things that would take place, plus where it would go, plus how you could map it, and we end up with a system based on Descartes called Cartesian coordinates, which I'm sure you've seen. Yes? By the way, he's supposedly developed this, and this comes from A.C. Grayling, sleeping in bed one morning and musing and thinking, and he looked up on the ceiling and he saw a fly walking around on the ceiling. And it occurred to him that if he developed this system, he would be able to map exactly where the fly was and where it went, and basically track it, and so on. And as a result of that, we end up with the Descartes Cartesian coordinate system. It puzzled me for years that Descartes would be named after a system that he invented, but then it occurred to me that actually the Cartesian system was probably named for Descartes. I don't know which came first, Descartes or... Okay. I was going to tell a joke, but I'll leave that one out.
I want to hear it.
Which comes first, Descartes or the hearse, or the horse, or, yeah, there's version, there's lots of versions. The actual expression is the horse has to come before the cart.
Before the day.
Yeah, yeah, so.
That should be the quiz question. Which came first?
So there, but that's cool. And he invented that. Algebraic geometry is what he invented there. And by the way, in his own day, he was more famous as a mathematician than he was as a philosopher. But so A.C. Grayling argues that not only was he in artillery because he was designing mathematical equations that would help artillery blow people up and stuff. I don't know if he was like Galileo and had people stand there and let me know how close we get. Probably not.
And someone had to time it.
Yeah, someone had to be, there with.
The
I'm
sundial-
holding a
sundial
time
for this movie.
clock, and you actually would have to have a clock to time it. And where did the clocks come from? Well, how about did I ever show you this movie? I did? Shoot, I've shown you everything. I guess I'm done.
We're philosophers now.
It's official.
Yeah.
Did I show you the scene where they're in the room with the clock?
I think we saw a pendulum swing, but I don't think we saw the clock.
Well, yeah, okay, you're not. You know what's neat? I just read yesterday that if you go to Florence, to the Dome, the clock there goes counterclockwise. Because that clock was built before they made the decision of which way clocks should go. I haven't yet seen it myself, but you've all seen, you all went home after I showed you this movie the last time and you played the whole movie and watched it and enjoyed it, and now you know. Well, actually, let me just play this rest part, because this is where she mentions Descartes. So, Descartes introduced such thinking. Did you hear that? I don't. No. You could always go and watch the movie. It's absolutely terrific. It was one of a mega hit in its day. I mean, 3 actors walking around for over an hour and a half discussing physics. Just amazing how popular the movie was.
Is that a joke?
Pardon?
Is that a joke?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. I know my jokes aren't funny. I think I warned you the first night, right?
Just
I
that-
tell jokes that are just not
What
funny.
if I said
I was
that?
being honest.
I missed the question.
What can I say? I wish my jokes were funny, but they are.
I think there's so much merit to your jokes.
Oh, okay. I
There's
could still get a merit badge.
much
then.
merit.
Okay,
I'm not a sarcastic person.
so Descartes was a spy, perhaps, according to A.C. Grayling, and so all this traveling around to the various wars and everything, he was probably, according to A.C. Grayling, I don't know that everybody would agree, spying on the enemy and bringing the information back to the Jesuits for the French king. But when the one king died and the new king replaced him, he didn't like the same group or associates. And by the way, Descartes was also considered by some to be associated with the Rosicrucians, the Society of the Rosy Cross. You familiar with that? There really was such an organization. They have good history about it. The Rosicrucians. I'm lost.
Is it referenced by Dan Brown in one of his books?
The person I'm using is a British historian, Niles Ferguson, I think.
Who's Dan
So,
Brown?
Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons.
so I don't know if this is a good site or not. Join our order. That's probably, it's not. Where's Wikipedia? That would help. Okay, here we go. But so they really were considered a secret society among the educated who were anti-church. And the idea is that as one of his goals as a spy for the Jesuits, he was also supposed to find out more about this secret society. And the way you find out about a secret society is pretending you're one of them yourself. But one of the problems is that the Rosicrucians were famously invisible. And Descartes pointed out that he couldn't have been a member because he was visible. However, he left Paris and headed to the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, we know a lot about what he did while he was there. One of the things was Rembrandt, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulip. He did change his name to Tulip eventually, from Tulp. Pick a picture, any of those, I guess. What? Go figure. Where am I here? I'll just go to the Wikipedia page. So, this is a painting by Rembrandt in Amsterdam, and that's Dr. Tulip, or Tulip. And yes, he's famous for also liking a particular type of flower and encouraging its proliferation in the Netherlands. And yes, if you go to the Netherlands today, the tulips are like all over the place. Yes? I mean, they were a real flower, but they're called tulips because of his owning them or something. So he was wealthy and a doctor, and these are all doctors, and they paid Rembrandt separately to pose to be in this picture, but this was an actual event where he gave an anatomy lesson. In fact, we all even know who the corpse was. They have the records of who it was, and we know for sure that he didn't have his right arm because that had been already cut off for a previous crime, and he had been hung that day, and Dr. Tulip had paid to have his body delivered for this anatomy lesson, which, by the way, is a dinner and a show. So all the people are sitting around watching this and having dinner at the same time as watching the anatomy lesson. And what we know is that one of the people at this particular anatomy lesson was René Descartes, who was definitely very interested in anatomy and dissection of all sorts of things. And it's pretty darn clear that Descartes also dissected things because he is famous for discovering the pineal gland.
He nailed dogs to boards.
This is actually one of Descartes' drawings. And notice the pineal gland is situated right above the spinal column, and he discovered that, which means he was dissecting a body. That's how you find things in the middle of the brain. And we know he was dissecting other animals and so on. In fact, he kept moving every 3 months, and it seems like the main reason he was moving constantly was because they didn't have soaps and, you dissect dead animals in your dining room, and you don't really clean up afterwards. 3 months is about as long as anyone can stand, right? So he keeps moving around. And if you wanted to find where Descartes was, you had to go through Father Mersenne, who was the hub person who connected Descartes with Hobbes and with Galileo and others in Paris. He was kind of, there's books about him too, because he's the one that, by his organizing and connecting people, really made a lot of this stuff move and encouraged people to be interactive with one another. For example, in the Meditations that Descartes writes, one of the individuals who responded with arguments was Thomas Hobbes. And then Descartes replies, and Hobbes replies again, and so on. So you've got back and forth as part of the original publication. So you know that they're talking with one another, at least writing to one another. And Descartes and Galileo. Descartes, his first book actually, that never got published, was on the movements of the Earth, and he never published that because, of course, he heard what happened to Galileo, and so he didn't want to get in the same kind of trouble himself, even though by staying in the Netherlands, he was a little bit safer because the Netherlands was in between Catholic France and Lutheran Northern Germany. And so the Netherlands were very smart business folk. They didn't want to take sides. They wanted business from both sides. And so they had really liberal policies with regard to religion in the Netherlands. Even Jews were allowed to live there, although there were some strict requirements on the way the Jews were allowed to behave. But by the way, the Jews that were kicked out of Spain, a lot of them went to the Netherlands. Spinoza's family, for example, which we will talk about next class, actually. Okay, so interesting thing about the pineal gland for Descartes is that Descartes is a mind-body dualist. As you see, a mind-body dualist. And the fascinating thing about this is that Thomas Hobbes was not a mind-body dualist, but believed that the body was completely physical, including its mind. So in other words, our mind in Hobbes's thinking is not a separate non-substance soul-like thing, but instead is part of the body, right? So if you think, okay, both of them are influenced by Galileo, and remember what's interesting about Galileo, among other things, is physics, how motions are part of kind of a chain of motions and so on. For Descartes, the whole body is like a machine, just like that clock that Sophie, whatever her name is in that movie, is talking about. Descartes changed the way everyone thought into thinking that everything was like a clock, right? With Hobbes, the body is like a clock, but the difference between them is Descartes argues that even though the clock is a well-made clock, what runs it is your soul, your mind, which somehow sits in a driver's seat in the pineal gland and drives the body. So you end up with what's referred to as a homunculus. Which is kind of a silly thing. You've got this guy sitting in the driver's seat driving the body, right? And that's the mind, right? Now, that reminds me, if you've seen the movie or read the book, Ready Player One? Ready Player One, anybody? No?
Is it the one where he puts the glasses on, or the goggles?
Yes. And once he has them on, though, he's in a world where he's actually running a robot, or some of his friends do, right? So they ride these robots and everything, like they're sitting in the driver's seat. That's what I was thinking of, but yeah. In any case, this leads to a problem, because people then ask, well, if this is the body of the mind, who's in the mind of the mind? And who's in the mind of the mind of the mind, and so on. So that becomes an infinite regression problem of where the mind sits. And part of the problem is, if you figure the mind doesn't have any substance, how is it driving the physical machine that it's driving, right? You know, there's no arms or legs for the mind to use to turn the wheels and so on. So that's just silly.
So, are you a mind-body dualist, or are you the other one? You didn't give us a name for the other one.
For the other one?
Mind as a result of the body.
Well, Hobbes argues that the mind is completely physical.
Yeah, that. Was,
And so for Hobbes, as you read the Leviathan, it starts off talking about senses, and how all the senses receive particles that move, following Galileo, into, you know, the tubes that are in our bodies, into our brains, and then they keep these movements keep going and create imagination and dreams and thoughts, and our language is the same kind of thing. I remember reading in the Leviathan where he talks about our eyes seeing objects, that in order for us to see the objects, particles from the objects have to be flying into our eyes.
Photons.
Exactly. But at the time that I read that, I was thinking, how stupid. All these little particles flying into our eyes, but yes, that's actually where we go with that, is photons. So that's kind of impressive, really. I mean, it's amazing that in his time and day, he comes up with all of this stuff, right? But this particular problem here is referred to as Descartes' error. Which is a book, of course, by Antonio Damasio, who's a contemporary brain scientist. Descartes' error. So the idea that the human brain is actually an invisible, abstract entity that kind of sits in the pineal gland and drives the body is something that contemporary mind neurologists think is absolutely ridiculous, so they refer to it as Descartes' error. But now here's my thinking on what Descartes was doing. I think Descartes actually agrees with Hobbes and would think that the mind is really just totally physical, but he didn't want to get in trouble with the church for saying that there was no soul. It's kind of amazing that Hobbes didn't get in trouble for that. But Descartes tried to protect himself, I think, by arguing that he had a spiritual soul, the mind, that kind of still was that soul that the church would have considered to be the self, right? But at the same time, he disguised his thinking enough that we really don't know.
Yeah, it just seems like there are glaring logical.
Yes.
That's my.
It seems too crazy. And in a sense, it's worse because of how, in the Meditations, Descartes, trying to prove that we could build a solid foundation for our knowledge, argues that I will introduce universal doubt. And so he creates this idea of, well, not only can you easily realize that things look differently under different circumstances. Wax is one of his favorites, you know, how as it warms up it gets soft and so on. But under different lighting conditions, colors change, all sorts of things. And I could be dreaming, and so not even sure that what I'm experiencing is real. It might be just a dream. And so how do I know that this isn't just a dream, and so on? You've seen the movie The Matrix?
Yep.
Everybody? That's like the perfect Descartes dilemma of, you know, the evil deceiver being the computer that makes everyone think that they're living a full life, when in fact they're really just sitting in a vat of jello.
All those more allegory to Kate. Because it even says that the person that does escape has the responsibility to free his own fellow.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that one too, yeah. I think it works both ways. But in this case, you know, the computer is deceiving us. Reality isn't really out there like it is. It's totally created by this evil deceiver. But the thing Descartes argues then, and he takes this is an old approach to the skeptical problem that comes from Augustine, who in one paragraph basically argues what Descartes takes into a 6-day musing, right, in bed, right? And Augustine says there's 3 things I know for sure. First, that I exist. Because if I don't exist, who is it that's doubting it? It has to be me that exists, right? And then I love knowing that I exist. And, you know, it's clearly the case that I exist, and so it's clearly the case that I love that I know that I exist. And then the third is that, love is the last one. No, okay, so the second one is I know that I know. I know that I exist, and I know that I know, because I can't doubt that, right? And so therefore, I love knowing that I exist, etc. So there's 3 things for Augustine that I know for sure. And by the way, that matches the Trinity. So that's kind of a cool thing. So clearly Descartes' familiar with Augustine, but he does a little bit more of a job with it and takes us through the evil deceiver who makes us think that we exist when we really don't. But of course, we must, because if the deceiver is deceiving someone into thinking that they don't exist, I must exist in order for that deceiving to happen to me, right? So I must exist. But then what Descartes does is really wishy-washy, and that is to go and say, because everybody agrees, right? Cogito ergo sum, that's the famous line. If you're at a cocktail party and someone says Descartes, don't say to be or not to be, that's Hamlet. Right? Instead you say cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, ergo, therefore, sum, I am. Sum as est, sumus est is sunt, etc. Still remember Father Brown going through it. Sum as est, sumus est is sunt. With, you know, big, you know. It was great. High school. Okay. So, the next step then is, I have this conception of an omnipotent God. And the cause must always be greater than the effect. And since the cause must always be greater than the effect, and I'm a finite human being, and God is omnipotent, I can't be possibly the cause of the idea of an omnipotent, beneficent, etc. God. The only thing that could be is an omnipotent God, and so therefore God must exist. So this is Descartes' version of the ontological argument, which everybody just kind of laughs at. But then he goes on to say, and since God is beneficent and omnipotent, everything that he lets me know clearly and distinctly must be true. Well, of course, now this is political, I think, because what he wants to say is that what I know clearly and distinctly is mathematics, not church dogma. And mathematics, I'm actually the one that's good at it, not the church. So in other words, mathematics should become the basic knowledge starting point and not what the church tells you. And he also has, one of his other main books is the method. I'm not getting the, okay, so the discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason, which is obviously on the web, and you could read it. And what this is to take you through how science should work, how you should do science, experience, and so on. And you think, wow, well, didn't they all know that? No, this is all brand new stuff. Remember, Francis Bacon is trying to do the same sort of thing, and compare it with another individual named Theodore, Theodore Mayer, who's also known as Europe's physician. And why is he fascinating? And by the way, I'm sure he never dressed like that. That's totally wrong for the period. But I guess the painter ad-libbed a little bit. And why?
That's funny.
It's just not the way they dressed that
I
time.
mean, but why would
Maybe he went to a college toga party or something. I don't know.
I guess someone snapped a painting of him and he said, oh,
Snapped a painting
Yeah,
or like snapped a picture.
with their cell phone, I guess.
I don't know how that's.
Remember Lincoln said, you can't believe everything you read on the internet.
Yeah.
Okay, so the neat thing about Dr. Mayer, he himself, by the way, was a follower of Paracelsius, Paracelsian theories. Who was Paracelsius? Anybody familiar with him at all? He's a physicalist. He was arguing that specific chemicals and foods and fluids, what the heck is all this? So this is the idea that physical ingredients have something to do with our health. And that's kind of amazing in a time where people believe that the body is corrupt and the soul is the important part of us, and in order to make sure our soul is saved, what we have to do is beat the body, whip ourselves, use a cilice or a hair shirt or something in order to punish ourselves. Fast, and the more you fasted, the better. Because what you're trying to do is make sure that the body keeps its place and you let the soul be in charge. And what made the soul get tempted was physical pleasures that the body had, right? Those pleasures that's the body enjoying